I started my career, like many of you in the audience, as a customer. And then I went on to become a partner. And it was through these experiences as a customer and a partner in the early days of application transformation that I understood that I wanted to become an F5er. 7 years ago, I made that transition. And as we now pick up in that application transformation where Calvin left off yesterday, in this multi-cloud world, we need to take a different approach to security, an application-centric security approach. And taking a step back, we first have to take a look at application-centric threats. And an application is only as good as the sum of the parts. And when we start to look at this, threats are specifically targeting application infrastructure components, such as your network, such as your domain name services, such as your transport layer security. And then, of course, they're targeting the application's OWASP and application web security projects' top 10 risks, such as SQL injection, or cross-site scripting, or credential stuffing. And then, as all of you as customers in this application economy, as applications have ultimately become your business, there are unique threats that are targeting this business. Each of you have data currency, the value that you place on your own data. And chew on this. There's motivations. There's criminal. There's hacktivism. There's corporate espionage. And there's information warfare. And these motivations, just as you put value on your own data, these malicious entities also have significant value on your data. You can get a credit card in the black market for as little as $5. You can get a social security number for as little as $150. And as we transition from this traditional online advertising model, or traditional advertising model, to an online advertising model, we also see new threats, such as click fraud. And then in a matter of seconds, your businesses can be impacted by online corporate espionage. Or for the federal customers that are in the room, it's economy of scale to be able to launch information warfare attacks, compromising your data in a much more cost-effective means. And then the arsenal of tools are becoming so much more sophisticated. The same maturity around automation that we all strive for in our private cloud environments is the same maturity that hackers have already realized in automating different attacks, such as the botnets that Francois talked about yesterday, where we have millions of computers that have been compromised through malware. And it's this automation that's leveraging these botnets along with different types of attacks, multi-layer attacks, which are targeting the application infrastructure, the application itself, and your individual application economy. And then these attacks have become so much more difficult to see, because that very same privacy that we all seek has left us with an internet that is almost 100% encrypted. Today, it's believed to be at least 70% encrypted. And then if we take a look at one of these specific examples of an application attack, there's a concept that we've all been throwing around, which is zero trust. I arrived in the airport on Sunday and my MiFi wasn't working, so I connected to the access point in the airport. And then I got on the airline in Alaska and I connected to GoGo. And then I got to my hotel and I connected to an access point, none of which can be trusted. And there are malicious entities that are using tools such as SSL strip that are intercepting traffic. But there are preventions for these types of tools, such as HTTP strict security. But the challenge is, as we've seen, where F5 Labs Threat Research has been spending the last 3 years looking at the entire footprint of SSL TLS, and what we've discovered is only 2% of us are actually implementing this type of feature. And if we take a second look at F5 application threat intelligence, in early 2016, we saw some very interesting anomalies. We saw a 1,400% increase in scanning of SSH and Telnet type devices. We saw this as a precursor, and we actually published our first volume 1 research in early 2016, where we anticipated that we were going to see massive attacks. Later in the year, we now are all familiar with the Mirai attack. Attacks that were as large as 1 gigabit. 1 terabit. And as we start to as we've seen Mirai actually expand, we are now seeing man-in-the-middle attacks or spyware attacks, or they're being launched for other types of DDoS attacks. And then there is even widespread speculation that there is an entire dark web being comprised of bots or thingbots. And then when we start to look at this multi-cloud world that we now live in, the attack surface is different. We thought the attack surface was significant when we had 65,535 UDP ports and TCP ports, but the reality is we had control over our own data centers, over the data that existed in there. Now many of you as customers may have 10, 15, 30, maybe even more SaaS applications, and maybe just as many vendors that have to manage those particular applications. And you're migrating to a more orchestrated private cloud. And now public cloud, where we have not 10, not 15, but hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of applications. And it is our core belief at F5 that the application is the gateway to your data, which means that every single place that these applications reside, you have an opportunity for your data to be compromised. And when we take a look at what is required, we believe there are 3 core security essentials that are absolutely necessary to address application-centric security. The first is visibility. You cannot see what you cannot secure what you do not know, and ultimately what you can see. Secondly is context. If I'm a bodyguard, I need to have the context of who I'm guarding. I need to understand their traditional behaviors so I understand when I see anomalies. And then there is control. But when we talk about control, we don't mean a wrapper around whatever it is we're trying to protect. We need that control to be intrinsic to the system or the environment that we are trying to protect. And so when we take a deeper look at visibility, we all know that we need to have full visibility to this application ecosystem. But there are things that are preventing this from happening. So we talked about 70+% of the entire internet is encrypted. This encryption is having significant hindrance on the current security investments that you have already made. In some instances, significantly impacting them, and others completely deprecating their effectiveness. So we need full visibility to this application ecosystem. The second is context. And this context is no longer just users connecting to applications. It's major systems and processes and other applications connecting to those applications. In fact, I was talking to a customer in our Executive Business Center in Seattle just a couple weeks ago. And this customer said they had 4,000 applications. But more importantly, they had 20,000 connectors to these applications. And then when we do look at the fact that users are still connecting to these applications, we need to know what device they're on, what geolocation they're coming from. We need to have an understanding of whether they have endpoint inspection, whether they have malware that they may be injecting into your application. We need to ensure that we understand whether they have the appropriate authorization to access that application. And then within the network, we need to understand, is it up? Is it available? Is there latency? And in the cloud environment, we need to look at the user and understand to inspect them before they go to the SaaS environments. Or for multi-cloud environment, we need to understand whether policies are going to a private cloud or whether they're going to a public cloud or maybe even multiple public clouds where we need transformation of those policies. And then, of course, as we've been talking, we need to ensure that we have the context of the application threats and the associated vulnerabilities to your applications. And then looking at control. I mentioned not being a wrapper and being intrinsic. When we look at control, it reminds me of a time when I was in the military, and ultimately I had transitioned out, and I tried to implement control in the corporate world, and I ultimately failed. And the reason I failed was because I was coming from a world that had context where I was in a SCIF, a specially compartmented information facility that had top secret information. And I transitioned to a corporate world that had Beer Friday, not with one type of beer, but 10 different types of beer. It was like dropping sod on a piece of cement and expecting it to grow. And the reality is that since then, I've come to realize in my career as I've matured that I need to understand where I am in the hemisphere. I need to understand how much sunlight there is. I need to understand how much rain there is. I need to understand what the condition of the soil is. And when I have this understanding, that these controls will have an opportunity to grow. And if we look at this same analogy, as we try to build security controls in this multi-cloud environment, is that we're going from this world that is very monolithic. And a monolithic world that worked when we had one web application firewall and we had 10 apps. But now that we have hundreds and thousands of applications, this monolithic world has been broken because we now have multiple web frameworks and we have significant amount of false positives, false negatives, and I would argue that we've already broken that model. We need to go to a world that is modular, a world that empowers the SecOps people to work with the DevOps individuals, a world that sees the security ops individual creating a policy based off of risk of their understanding of the context to the application and the data behind that application, and a DevOps individual that ultimately understands how to deploy that overall policy within their standard development lifecycle and roll them out based off of the context to the appropriate multi-cloud environment. And when that policy is no longer compliant because the risk has changed, as Calvin talked about yesterday, we can rinse and repeat. This multi-cloud world that we now are living in is an opportunity to do security right, to apply policy based off of risk to a given application, not hundreds of applications. And so F5 leverages the foundation of this visibility, of this context, and of this control to bring through you partners to the most important people in this room, to you customers, the most comprehensive set of application-centric portfolio that exists on the market. One that starts with F5 threat research, through F5 Labs, where we're working 24/7 to understand your application threats. And then through subscription services, such as our threat subscription services that enable us to automate those learnings to where you can mitigate these threats in real time. And then as we know that the application is only as good as the sum of its parts, we have technologies such as our Herculon hybrid DDoS defender that enables you to be able to provide mitigations for DDoS to ensure you have availability to your network, to your transport layer security, to your domain name services. And as each of you look to take back control of those controls that you have essentially are not leveraging those investments in, we have Herculon SSL, which gives you full visibility to all of that traffic. And then DNS services, which prevent attacks such as man in the middle or DNS hijacking, as we saw in a bank in South America in 2016, where they hijacked their DNS for 5 hours, routed it to a fake website, and stole a significant amount of credentials. And then we look at the application itself. We need to understand what systems, what processes, what users, what other applications are authorized. And once we know what they're authorized, we need to be able to invoke multi-factor authentication, and then we need to be able to account for what they ultimately did. And then when we look at attacks such as credential stuffing, which is leveraging the 2 billion records that were compromised in 2016 and leveraging this automation that I talked about earlier, are launching attacks to all of the other websites that our users are using, because we all know they use the same password. Through our keystroke encryption, we can mitigate this attack through web fraud protection. And then there, of course, is the web application firewall, which enable us to mitigate attacks such as SQL injection. And I know you say SQL injection, it's been around 20 years. It's still the number 2 way that attackers are compromising data in your applications. And then the reality is that even if we have the strongest portfolio of application-centric protections on the market, they are absolutely useless if they're on an island and we can't connect them to that multi-cloud environment that each of us all now currently live in. An environment that requires us to have federated identity to take back control of our SaaS applications to where we can do inspection on them before we authorize the user to go to them. Or our integration through NSX and ACI, which empowers us to be able to orchestrate policies within your private cloud environment. Or through containers and application service proxy, which allow us to connect to those containers. Or, as Calvin talked about yesterday, for those of you who want to leverage that platform or that chassis with those modules, those security modules, in your co-located data center, but you still want to connect to the public cloud, we enable you to do that with Application Connector. And then when we dive in full, all in, to this public cloud environment, we need to ensure that you have a catalog of services and CloudFormation templates that are in Git, but that are also available on the storefront of AWS and Azure and Google. And then we've listened to you as customers, where we have an understanding that 60% of you will have your WAF and your DDoS outsourced by 2020. And as many as 70% of you will do the same with DNS. And so you can leverage F5 to transfer those risks to a business who is focused 24/7, 365 on these challenges, to enable you to focus on risks that are unique to your business. And then there's the Cert, the Security Incident Response Team. I was at Black Hat just 4 days ago, Black Hat Security Conference in Las Vegas, and I was talking to John George, who manages the Cert team. And he was yelling at the rooftop, people need to know about the Cert. What everyone in this room needs to understand with the Cert is that if you have an application security incident, we will help you. Pick up the phone. If you don't have a security module, we will help you. And so John was telling me he had a customer literally just hours before that had called 3 different security vendors, and they all said, we're going to charge you. And we helped them and blocked a phishing attack within 45 minutes with an eye roll. Now granted, they didn't have a security module. Was it the most optimized for the longer term? No. But it mitigated the threat immediately, and we are now working with that customer through one of you partners, ultimately to give them the appropriate long-term mitigation. And so it is the collection of this portfolio through you partners to the customers in a world where security ultimately needs to follow the application. I appreciate the time. Thank you.